Hey everybody, this is Dr. Jacobs, and welcome to Module 3, where we're going to learn about prenatal development and pregnancy. So there's going to be some unit learning objectives that I want you to be able to do by the end of this unit. I'd like you to be able to identify the parts and functions of the reproductive organs. I'd like you to be able to explain how the human reproductive system works from prior to conception through birth. I'd like you to be able to distinguish among the germinal, embryonic, and fetal stages of prenatal development. I'd like you to be able to explain prenatal development, pregnancy, labor, birth, and birth of the placenta. I'd also like you to be able to explain genetic environmental threats to the developing baby. And I want you to be able to explain how prenatal development impacts lifelong development. All right. So let's get started. So the unit materials start by going through some of the biological foundations of development. And I've taught this class for a really, really long time now. And something that I'm always amazed about is how well people don't know their bodies and things with sexual reproduction that are things that I would have thought were some basics. So when we're talking about pregnancy and prenatal development, we're going to have a couple different timelines because these are actually two different things. All right. So we're going to see this timeline be slightly different. So when we talk about prenatal development, we're talking about the development of the baby. When we're talking about pregnancy, it refers to the development of the female carrying the baby. So we're going to learn about gametes. And these are just basically the sex cells. And male and female bodies have different sex cells. The male gamete is sperm. And sperm actually have a life cycle of about 42 to 76 days from the creation of the sperm through ejaculation. The female gamete is the ova or ovum, also known as the eggs. These are present at birth, but they're not mature at birth. And so the ovum will mature across the lifespan. Each gamete contains 23 chromosomes, which contain DNA in them. So if we're looking at the male reproductive system, there are tons of different parts, but there's certain ones that we're going to pay attention to just as an introductory to this class. So there's going to be the testes. It's going to be the structure where the sperm kind of hang out. We have the vas deferens, which is the tube that leads to the urethra. So the sperm will continue through the vas deferens, go into the urethra, which goes through the penis, where it will ejaculate. We also have the female reproductive system. And here we see the ovaries. That's going to house the ovum. That's a pretty easy one to remember. If you look at the first three letters of the word, it's ova, O-V-A. And so we know that's where we're going to have our little eggs hang out. And so the ova is the egg that will be released from the ovary. And it will go into the fallopian tube. So if we're looking at our structure there, if you see where the ovary is, they have not labeled the fallopian tubes, but it's the long tube-like structure that leads from the ovaries into the uterus. So the uterus is that pear-shaped organ. If we're talking about sexual reproduction, that is where the baby will be housed. The uterus is lined with something called endometrium. And we will get more into this when we're starting to talk about the menstrual cycle, but the endometrium are basically the lining of the uterus. If you've ever heard someone talk about having endometriosis, this is where you have endometrium that grows outside of the uterus. We also have the cervix, which is the opening of the uterus. When we talk about pregnancy, the cervix actually will be plugged up by something called a mucus plug, which we can talk about later. So here's just another couple images that have a little bit more detail in a way that's easier to see. And so we see after the cervix, you see the opening into the vagina. All right, so the menstrual cycle. The average menstrual cycle is 28 days. It doesn't mean that every person who menstruates will have a 28-day cycle. This is just an average. So when we're talking about sex, don't be like, well, Dr. Jacobs, you said this happens on this day and now we're pregnant. Just know these are averages. It's not going to be the same for everyone. There's so many different things that influence the menstrual cycle and sexual reproduction. So just because it's true for one person doesn't mean it's going to be true for everybody. But the average menstrual cycle is about 28 days. Day one of the cycle, that begins with the shedding of the endometrium. You probably see this referred to as the period. So this is when the bleeding's occurring. Day 14 of the cycle is right around day 14. Remember, it's not going to be day 14 for everyone, is when ovulation happens. This is when the ovary drops an ova. And so you'll notice, if you remember back from the diagrams from the previous slides, there's two ovaries. There's one on the left, one on the right. And typically what we'll see is one ovary drop an egg 1 month, and then the ovary on the other side drop one the next month. That's not always true. Sometimes people can drop multiple eggs in a cycle. Sometimes people won't ovulate. And so there's a whole bunch of different things, but typically if we talk about ovulation, we'll say it's right about day 14. You can actually become sexually aroused, which can trigger ovulation. So there's just a whole bunch of different things that can influence that. So if ova is not fertilized, the menstrual cycle begins again. If it is fertilized, we have conception, and that will start where we're talking about prenatal development. So there's 3 specific stages of prenatal development. The first one we have is going to be called the germinal stage. The second stage is called embryonic stage. And the third stage of prenatal development is going to be called fetal stage. So if you remember, when we're talking about prenatal development, we're talking about the developing baby. So in the germinal stage, it starts at conception. And when a sperm and ovum fuse together, or ova fuse together, then we have a zygote. The zygote will start going through mitosis, and it will eventually become something called a blastocyst. So once it starts rapidly dividing and replicating about day 5 or 6 after conception, it becomes a blastocyst, or rapidly dividing ball of cells. And that lasts until about implantation, or until implantation into the uterine wall. So that blastocyst will implant into the uterine wall. If it doesn't, then the fertilized egg will travel outside of the body, and then the menstrual cycle will start over again. So a lot of times, there's many pregnancies that actually there was conception take place, but because it does not implant in the uterine wall, it does not become a viable pregnancy. We also have embryonic stage. This lasts about 6 weeks after implantation. So once implantation happens, we have about 6 weeks. And this is when almost all of the vital organs are formed. So this is also the time, for the most part, where babies are the most sensitive to different substances and things happening. So if someone drinks alcohol during the stage when they are pregnant, it's very likely there's going to be severe damage to the embryo. And it's actually never good to drink during pregnancy. Let's go back and step back a little bit. There is no amount of alcohol that is safe during pregnancy. There used to be a time when doctors would tell people that people could have alcohol during pregnancy. There's no amount of safe alcohol for a pregnant human to consume and keep a baby safe. So that's really important. If you have a doctor tell you that, run. So again, this is when babies are very susceptible to teratogens, because all of the major systems are coming online during this stage. So let's talk a little bit about folic acid. So it's recommended that females who are sexually active with males take about 400 milligrams of folic acid daily before and during early pregnancy. And then once someone knows that they're pregnant, that they should increase that to 600 milligrams daily. Because what this does, it reduces the risk for neural tube deficits like spina bifida. And so what it does, it helps the spinal column close off and form properly. So how do babies grow? There's a sequence that babies grow. Our materials only covered 2 of these, but there's actually 3 of these about the way that babies grow in utero. So there's one called the proximodistal sequence. There's one called the cephalocaudal sequence. And there's also this third one, which our materials left out, called the mastospecific sequence. So let's back up a little bit. When we're looking at the proximodistal sequence, let's break that word into 2 different words. So when you see proximo, what word do you think of? If you said proximal, that's right. And then if we look at the second half of that word, it would be distal. So when we say proximal or something's proximal to something else, we say it's close. And if we say if something is distal, we say that's far away. So what this means is that when babies are developing in utero, they tend to develop from the inner trunk out. So we'll see like the baby develop their core first before they're developing some of their arms and their fingers and things like that. We also have the cephalocaudal sequence. So cephalo means head, caudal means tail. So babies also develop their head first before they develop the rest of their body. So they'll develop their head, their trunk of their body, before they develop their legs and their toes. The third one that the book left out, or the materials left out, is called the mastospecific sequence. And this is just basically saying that the larger structures typically develop before the smaller ones. So here we're going to see the trunk of the body develop before we get fingers and fingernails and things like that. Something that's interesting about this is not the last time that we're going to see these words, because we actually see motor movements develop in similar ways. So we will see this again. So in the fetal stage, this is the last stage of prenatal development. This we see occur, and then we see the age of viability happen around 20 to 23 weeks, or 22 to 23 weeks. Age of viability is basically when a baby can survive outside of the womb. And it's really interesting because I've actually seen this number go down as I've taught this class for almost, for a really long time now. And why do you think that is? If you said technology, you're absolutely right. We have seen huge increases in the technology that we can use in the treatment for children. And so, we have things to talk about with the stage like the umbilical cord, which we know provides the nutrients to the baby. We have the placenta that acts as a barrier, but allows waste and things to transport into the mother. And then we have the amniotic sac, which is this clear sac that protects the baby from bacteria and things like that. So earlier when we were talking about the mucus plug, we have a mucus plug that also helps to protect the baby from bacteria from outside of their womb. And as a woman progresses through labor and birth, we actually can lose that mucus plug, which is like this gelatinous. It looks like clear jello. Sometimes it can be tinged with a little bit of blood, but that's future us. And by future us, I mean later in this presentation, where we'll talk about more about that. So pregnancy then, if you remember, pregnancy is where we talk about the person carrying the baby. But the start of the pregnancy timeline might not be where you think it is. So we start counting prenatal development from conception. So when do you think they start counting the pregnancy timeline from? So they start counting the pregnancy timeline from the last menstrual period, or sometimes that's referred to as the LMP. Typically this is 2 weeks before conception. So let's think about this a little bit. So your last menstrual period, it's day 1 of your last cycle. So it's the day you first started your period. So I like to illustrate this with an example. So if you were in my in-person class, I would make this very dramatic for you. And I'd be like, all right. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Warrensburg since you're taking this class online, but I am told that Pine Street sometimes on Thursdays has something called Thirsty Thursdays, and people can find drink specials and things like this. So let's say we're out on Pine Street on a Thursday for Thirsty Thursday, and we're sitting in this bar, and we look across the bar and we see that person, and we're like, I'm going to marry that person one day. So yes, if you have watched How I Met Your Mother, that was a How I Met Your Mother reference. If you haven't, there's always time to watch that still. All right, so Hold on real quick. Sorry about that. Someone got really loud in my house, so I didn't want to keep continuing because I could not focus. So we're back talking about the LMP, or the last menstrual period. They start counting again, typically 2 weeks before conception. We started talking about Thirsty Thursday. We're in that bar. We see the person across the room, and we say we're going to marry that person one day. And let's say things go a certain kind of way, and you find out that you are pregnant with a Pine Street baby. So we joke about this. We actually named the Pine Street baby in the in-person class. And so if you go into the doctor, the funny thing about this is that they will actually start counting the pregnancy from 2 weeks, about 2 weeks before you met that person. And that can be really confusing for people because they're like, but I didn't even know them then. How can we start counting the pregnancy from them? That's because we go back to when the last menstrual period was, and that's when they first start counting the pregnancy. Why do you think they do that? So I have a question for all of my students who are sexually active. Do you write down every time you have sex on a calendar? Most people don't, right? And so the reason why they do 2 weeks prior to conception, or the last menstrual period, is that gives us kind of a set day, because we know ovulation occurs typically close to day 14 of the menstrual cycle. And so when they're doing this, they consider interim pregnancies from about 37 to 42 weeks. Remember, week 1 is from the last menstrual period when you're actually not pregnant. So when they're on the pregnancy timeline, the person is not pregnant for the first 2 weeks typically, unless ovulation occurs in a really early on. So our pregnancy timeline, we have 3 trimesters that we're going to talk about. Week 1 through 13 is the first trimester. The second trimester goes from week 14 to 26. The third trimester goes from weeks 27 to 40. Like I said earlier, interim is 37 to 42 weeks. Most pregnancies are right around 40 weeks long. And that's actually how they choose the EDD, or estimated date of delivery, also known as your due date. It's 40 weeks from your last menstrual period, or your last cycle. So in the first trimester, common symptoms include nausea, fatigue, breast tenderness, frequent urination. There's a lot going on. Body's working super hard. And most miscarriages actually occur during this trimester. And both the germinal and embryonic periods of prenatal development take place during the first trimester of pregnancy. So it's a really, really important time. And most people, may not know right away that they're pregnant. Especially if you are someone who menstruates, it's really important to kind of keep track of when your periods are. And they have apps and things for that now where you can do that in case you do become pregnant. Or it's good just to be able to track your cycles anyway, because your doctors sometimes want to know. So let's talk about teratogens a little bit. These are environmental substances that harm the developing baby. And so the books, or the materials spoke about a few things about this, like alcohol and cigarettes and, pesticides and all these different things. But there's a whole list of things that people who are pregnant are not supposed to eat. So let's call it the do not eat list. So what are common things you think females who are pregnant are not advised to consume? Some things that you may or may not have listed out loud were cold lunch meats, cold hot dogs, raw eggs, meat products that are rare, so like sushi or rare steak, and Caesar salad dressing. Some of you might be like, why? Because real Caesar salad dressing actually has anchovies in it. So this is because there's something called listeria, and this can be found in cold deli meats, things stored in refrigerators. Sometimes we even find it in fruits and vegetables. So it's really important to really wash produce. to make it safe for consumption. And listeria can cause miscarriage during pregnancy. It's actually not good for anyone. And we see several listeria recalls on food. So when I made this presentation, I Googled recent listeria recalls, and there was 2 active within the last day of creating this presentation. One was a cheese recall, and another one was imported frozen chicken. So it's something that's super common. I think, Caesar salad kits a lot of times will be recalled. A lot of cold chickens. So if you have these cold chicken salads, those will get recalled a lot too. The book also mentions fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Sometimes you'll hear that referred to as FASD. Sometimes people still call it FAS. They moved it to a spectrum disorder because although a lot of people think that all the characteristics are the same or the symptoms of it are the same, it's actually a spectrum, and a lot of cases aren't the same. So sometimes there are physical birth defects, but not always. Sometimes there are symptoms that can mimic ADHD, and there's a lot of research going on into this, where people thought that some children had a fetal alcohol or a ADHD, and it was actually a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And so that's a really interesting area of research that's burgeoning still. We also have the second trimester of pregnancy. Symptoms include decreased nausea, increased energy, better sleep, back pain, abdominal pain, leg cramps, constipation, and heartburn. This is actually the best of the trimesters. So I don't remember if I introduced to y'all that I have 4 kids. This is the one where you're not super big yet, and you don't feel as sick, so you get a little bit better sleep. Your abdominal muscles do feel like they're starting to stretch out, but it's not as bad as some of the other ones. So this is kind of the easier one. This is when you also get to experience quickening. So quickening is when you start feeling the baby move within the womb. And this happens between about 16 and 20 weeks. When you feel the baby move depends on a few things. It depends on how thick your uterus is. It also depends on if you've had a baby before. So you may not exactly know what to be waiting for, but after you've had your first one, then you kind of know what it feels like. It feels like little butterfly tickles that are tickling the insides. And it's pretty neat until they get stronger and then they start punching your bladder. That's not as fun. You can find out the biological sex of the baby around week 20. You can actually find out earlier, but most doctors are going to put the visit right around week 20 so they can check for some different things. There's a huge movement of people choosing not to find out the biological sex of their baby around then. There's other procedures where you can figure out earlier, like amniocentesis, where it looks at the DNA and you can figure out the biological sex of the baby as well. So then we move into our 3rd trimester. Symptoms during this trimester include shortness of breath, hemorrhoids, which aren't fun, urinary incontinence, so peeing yourself a little bit, varicose veins, Braxton Hicks contractions, sleep issues. The uterus goes from weighing about 2 ounces all the way up to 2.5 pounds. So you have this tiny, tiny uterus, and then it gets huge, as big as a basketball by the end of pregnancy. And so if the baby is born early, preterm birth, if you remember from earlier in our lecture, the interim is considered from week 37 up to 42. Preterm birth occurs with any birth that occurs before 37 weeks of pregnancy. Late preterm is 34 to 36 weeks. Moderately preterm is 32 to 34 weeks. Very preterm is less than 32 weeks. And extremely preterm is at or before 25 weeks. And so now we're going to talk about labor and birth. There are stages of labors, and there is going to be stages of birth as well. So the stages of birth have 3 parts. The first stage of birth is what we refer to as labor, which we'll talk about. Labor also has 3 stages, which are materials for this week omitted. So we'll talk about that too. So stages of birth. Stage 1 is called dilation and effacement. So that's going to be labor. Stage 2 is birth. And stage 3 is birth of the placenta. All right, so birth stage 1 is dilation and effacement. This gets broken down into 3 stages itself. So this is also known as labor. So our 3 stages of labor, our first one's gonna be early labor. Our second one's gonna be called active labor. And our third stage of labor is gonna be called transitional labor. So let's go over some more details on labor's stages. So our first one, early labor. This can happen hours or weeks before someone moves on to the next stage. In fact, you know, I was in early labor for probably almost a month with all of mine. I didn't have a very common pregnancy and labor experience, but my body just kept trying to progress through labor. And this is when the cervix opens to 3 centimeters. And this is when effacement begins. So effacement's the thinning out of the cervix. So the cervix is thick, has that mucus plug that we spoke about. It'll start to thin out and open up. And when it starts to open up, that's when that mucus plug can fall out. If someone's water breaks, so we see all those movies where you have the person in the grocery store and the shopping, and then just there's a flood and and the water breaks all over the floor. Actually, most people's water doesn't break, and so water breaking is when the amniotic sac tears or breaks, and most people have to have that broken. So what they do is they take this hook, they go in through the vagina, and then they snag the amniotic sac and they pull it, and then the water falls out, and it's actually amniotic fluid, not water per se. When that happens, that actually can help trigger people to progress through labor quicker. However, if the water does break on its own, that baby's going to have to come out within 24 hours most of the time, unless they're really early, because that baby can be exposed to things that are really not good for it. Contractions for this are about 5 to 20 minutes apart, last for 30 to 45 seconds. There's something else called Braxton Hicks contractions that we can talk about too. But these contractions, they'll start out really variable, and you can kind of feel your uterus contract, and it feels like hard. So if you put your thumb on your stomach, the stomach's really tight and hard. And then these will get more regular. It's not uncommon in pregnancy to have something called Braxton Hicks contractions, and these are actually fake contractions that are just preparing the uterus for labor. And I have some more materials in our folder for this week that give you a little bit more fun information about Braxton Hicks contractions. And so the first time you have it, you have no idea what's going on. And then slowly they get stronger. And then a lot of times people might mistake those for labor contractions, but they're very different. So when we move to these labor contractions, they're about 5 to 20 minutes apart for 30 to 45 seconds. They'll keep going. If you show up at the hospital and you're 2 centimeters dilated, they're probably just going to send you back home. The last month of pregnancy, if you are fortunate enough to have prenatal care, they'll actually be checking to see if how far effaced you are already, if you're dilated already. And with all of my pregnancies, before they induced me into labor, I was already dilated to 3 or 4 centimeters before they induced me. So induction happens sometimes if if someone goes past the 42 weeks, because after 42 weeks of being pregnant, that baby's gonna start pooping in utero, and that's not a good thing. It's not good for their lungs. It's just not good for the baby. The placenta can also start to deteriorate, which is not good either. And so they might induce for that. And what they'll do to induce labor is they'll give typically people something called Pitocin, which is a synthetic equivalent of oxytocin, which is the attachment hormone. So we'll talk about oxytocin quite a bit across the semester. And so they'll do this to induce. If someone stalls out in labor, they might give Pitocin as well to help try to make it more regular. So then we move on to stage 2, active labor. This, for most people, lasts 2 to 3.5 hours. And this is when the cervix opens up to 7 centimeters. In this, contractions become 3 to 4 minutes apart, lasting for about 40 to 60 seconds. If you birth a child in a hospital, they'll put this big belt around you that will monitor the contractions, and the fetal heartbeat. So it's kind of cool. You can watch the machine and the paper where they'll have the peak of the contraction, and it's kind of fun to watch. And you can start to see them form and more regularly, almost like you would see for a heartbeat. Labor stage 3, transitional labor. This is where it gets kind of rough. This lasts 15 minutes to an hour long. These contractions are fierce, okay? And this is when people open fully up to 10 centimeters. When this happens, you have the sudden urge, like you have to go to the bathroom or bear down or push. It's very like it's just inside you, like primal. And so these contractions are about 2 to 3 minutes apart, last for 60 to 90 seconds. They are not fun. They're not fun at all. By this time, if someone's going to choose to have epidural, they've already gotten the epidural, but you have to be careful. Anyone who plans on having children one day, to make sure if you're wanting an epidural, that one, they have more than one anesthesiologist, and that you get it early enough that you're not gonna go straight into transitional labor, because sometimes people move into that really quickly. So the second stage of birth, so we've moved through all the stages of labor, so we're going to the second stage of birth. For an uncomplicated birth, looks kind of like this. So you have the baby that's at some point they flip upside down, their head moves toward the vaginal canal. When you are to 10 centimeters, you have that urge to push. If you look there in the image D, that is the most painful part of giving birth. That's called crowning. It feels like a ring of fire. Sometimes people call it a ring of fire. And you probably feel like you can't push anymore. If you can get one more push, the baby just slips out, and hopefully the doctor catches the baby, because the head comes out, and then the shoulder just kind of moves really quickly. But we're not quite done yet. So we have the third stage of birth, which is the birth of the placenta. And I actually had no idea that this occurred until I started having kids myself. So you give birth to the baby, but you're not done yet. And this feels like everything is getting taken outside of, like, from inside of you. And I don't know how else to describe it, but when you birth the placenta, it just feels like everything's being pulled out of your insides. So this is the last stage of birth. And then once that happens, they'll usually cut the umbilical cord. They'll put the baby up to the mother to breastfeed. Even if the mother doesn't plan on breastfeeding, a lot of times they'll put the baby there because you actually don't have milk right away. When you give birth, you have something called colostrum, which is this yellow sticky substance that has really dense nutrients. And it also has a lot of things that can help protect babies from getting sick. And so with that, they'll do a newborn assessment on the baby. You probably heard of the APGAR evaluation. So they'll check for like the heart rate, breathing, muscle tone, if the baby has any reflexes, color. After you give birth to a baby, it's really wild how time just kind of freezes, and you just wait to hear that baby cry, because if a baby is crying, that means they can breathe. If they're not crying, they're not breathing. And so that can be, I think that is the slowest time has ever gone for me, for just such a short period of time. So directly after birth, um, like I said, they're going to encourage the person to breastfeed the baby. And that does a couple of different things. One, it helps provide the baby some nutrients and some protections from things because of that colostrum, which is this really nutrient dense yellow sticky stuff. And when the baby breastfeeds, it actually causes additional contractions of the uterus. So if you remember from earlier in our presentation, the uterus is the size of a basketball, and it wants to get back to being its normal size. And so breastfeeding helps cause those contractions so that the uterus can kind of to get back to how it's supposed to be. Skin to skin contact also can cause contractions, and that's because our bodies naturally release that hormone called oxytocin, which is so connected to so many things. It's to the contraction of the uterus. It's what they call the attachment hormone. So when we have that skin to skin contact, that helps us bond with other people. It's also what they use to trigger labor in people, the Pitocin, which is the equivalent, the synthetic equivalent of oxytocin. And it's pretty cool. You also see some medical care. They'll be checking the baby for things if the baby's underweight. They might have to do some heel sticks to check the blood sugar of the baby. They'll be checking on the mother's body. They'll go in and check the abdomen. They'll push on it. They'll check on the vaginal area. They'll be drawing blood and taking blood pressures and doing these things. They are going to be doing some screenings for the baby as well, checking hearing, checking different things. So for hospital discharge, it's natural for the baby to drop below birth weight, and this is because the milk's not in quite yet. So that colostrum, although it's good, baby's trying to figure out how to eat. The mom is trying to figure out how to feed baby, and so that baby's going to drop below birth weight, but and hospitals will not release you without proper car seat. So if you're in America, this is different in different countries. And then the mother's going to need someone to drive her home after she gives birth because she's not going to be able to push that brake pedal down, most likely. And it also depends on if they're going to have a vaginal delivery or a C-section. And with that, the milk usually comes in about 2 or 3 days after a baby is born. So if we're thinking about our beautiful Pine Street baby, what does our baby need to learn and do to grow into an adult, a well-functioning adult? So I want you to think about that. Think about all the things, because these are the themes that are going to go across our semester. We're going to be learning about all these things and how does a child develop, in what context do these children develop? How does society and genetics and environment and all of these things, and society and what society thinks right or wrong, and parents and the conflict and our identity, all of this goes into what we're going to be learning this semester. So thank you for this week. I look forward to keep growing with y'all.